Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the Cleveland Clinic and Ohio Clinicians for Climate Action's Climate and Health Activate, Educate, Implement Symposium. As a reminder, all of the live events are recorded and will be shared on the OCCA YouTube channel beginning next week. This symposium is a learn at your own pace symposium. All the pre-recorded sessions are available on the Whova app in the video gallery and can be watched at your convenience through midnight tonight. During these live events, we will watch the pre-recorded session and be joined by the speakers for a live Q&A. Next week, all the registrants of the symposium will be sent a link to the Ohio Clinicians for Climate Action website, where you can find the links to the education videos, Q&A sessions, as well as the slide presentations. This evening's presentation will be on advocacy at the local, state, and national level, given by John Sabin from Citizens Climate Lobby and Sarah Spence from the Ohio Environmental Council. After the pre-recorded session, we will be joined by the presenters for a Q&A session that will lead into a larger panel discussion with a few of the other speakers you have seen throughout the week, including Lucinda Cave, Dr. Alan Lockwood, Dr. Thijs Heus, and Emily Bacha. As a general reminder, please remain muted throughout the duration of the session. If you have questions for the speakers, please utilize the chat box. At the end of the presentation, I will populate a link to a survey for this evening's session. We invite everyone to complete the survey as it provides valuable information for the symposium hosts and speakers. Nurses, if you would like CNEs, you must complete the survey. Once you click submit, a link to your CNE certificate will be shown. Physicians, directions on how to obtain CMEs are in the syllabus located in the document section on Whova. All right, with that out of the way, let me share my screen and we will get into our presentation.
Hello, my name is John Sabin. I'm one of the Great Lakes regional coordinators for Citizens Climate Lobby. I've also been a social worker for 30 years, mostly in the field of mental health as a psychotherapist, but I've also worked as a medical social worker in hospice and palliative care.
Hi, I'm Sarah Spence. I am the Director of Climate Programs for the Ohio Environmental Council. So thank you for joining our webinar today on climate advocacy at the local, state, and national level. Today's learning objective is going to be to identify and explain ongoing public health policy proposals meant to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change, discuss policy limitations and unintended consequences. And so I'll just start a little bit by telling you guys about who we are at the Ohio Environmental Council. So the Ohio Environmental Council is a family of organizations. We have a traditional C3 educational organization. We have a C4 organization that allows us to do direct lobbying. And then we have a PAC that allows us to coordinate with candidates and a super PAC that allows us to do independent expenditure work. So what we do at the Ohio Environmental Council, we have 4 key areas of environmental policy that we focus on. And that's water, energy, public lands, and democracy. And so for our water work, we want to make sure that water is safe, clean, and affordable. For our energy work, we want to make sure that we are reducing carbon in our state's power sector. For public lands, we want to make sure that all Ohioans have access to outdoor green spaces where they can get away and enjoy recreation. And then for democracy work, we want to make sure that, in order to have a healthy environment, that we have a healthy democracy. And we do those work in those areas in 4 different ways. So we have an advocacy shop that works with legislators in creating policy. We have a communications team that really talks to the public about these important issues. We have regional directors that are throughout the state of Ohio connecting with locals on every level. And then we have a law center that helps communities when they're looking at rules or lawsuits around placement of energy projects or other issues that are going on in their areas. So I'll start by talking about local and state advocacy. That's kind of what we do at the Environmental Council. And so we'll start with the local level. So on the local level, Local municipalities, counties, townships usually do their legislation through local ordinances. And there are several different ways that this can impact health. And so, one example that I like to use is right now we're working with a city on streamlining solar installation. And so this is going to allow their residents to be able to put rooftop solar on their houses, which reduces their energy bills, but also helps reduce the strain on the grid. And so if you're using less electricity from the grid, that's less coal and natural gas that they're burning. Zoning is also a very important issue. Zoning is the area of where you can have residential areas, commercial areas, industrial areas. And so we want to make sure that when cities are doing zoning codes, that they're looking at this as in an equitable way, and don't have their lower income or minority residents living next to coal-fired power plants or heavy industrial polluting sites. And then with the state of Ohio, a lot of the health issues actually go through local health departments. And so I think there are over 130 local health departments within the state of Ohio. And then for OEC, the biggest way that we actually advocate with locals is through the Power Clean Future Ohio campaign. And so we are working with cities across the state of Ohio to reduce their carbon emissions by 30% by 2030. And so cities are signing up to work with us. We're providing them technical expertise and some additional capacity in order to be able to implement carbon emission reduction solutions in an equitable way. And then on the state level, we advocate at the Ohio General Assembly. This is the legislative branch for the state of Ohio. The Ohio General Assembly is currently in the 133rd General Assembly, and that lasts through the end of this year. So there have been a lot of bills that get introduced into the Ohio General Assembly. The House right now is currently around 760 bills. The Senate is around 350 bills. And so there's definitely a lot of work that gets done at the General Assembly as far as legislation introduced. On the energy side of things, we have been working on some legislation around energy, electric vehicle infrastructure and incentives. We've also been working on bills that will repeal House Bill 6 from earlier in this General Assembly. As some of you may know, House Bill 6 passed last year, and it got rid of Ohio's clean energy standards, and is also bailing out 2 nuclear plants and then 2 coal-fired plants, one here in Ohio and the other in Indiana. And so that's definitely important legislation that we would like to see repealed and kind of reset the conversation on energy policy. On the water side, we have been working with General Assembly members. Legislation has been introduced that would require schools to have water dispensing stations in order for students to be able to fill up water bottles. We've been working with Representative Crawley and Representative Greenspan on a water affordability bill. We've been working with actually the General Assembly and the governor on a program that's called H2 Ohio, which is going to help reduce toxic algae within Lake Erie, reduce nutrient runoff that goes into Lake Erie. And then there are also bills that have been introduced on regulating PFAS and helping get lead service lines replaced. And so all of these bills have various different health impacts. And so as a physician, we really encourage you to get involved and be able to lend your voice into the health impacts that good legislation can have. And so just quickly, I'll talk through how a bill becomes a law in Ohio. And so, and this example is actually from the Ohio General Assembly, but it's very similar actually on both the local and state levels. And so usually it's either a legislator or, in the case of a local level, a city council member, becomes aware of either a need or a concern or a problem. And so then they draft a bill. So for the Ohio General Assembly, they contact a organization called the Legislative Service Commission, which is a nonpartisan organization of attorneys that help to make sure that bills are crafted in a way that currently match with the Ohio Revised Code and the Ohio Constitution. So then that bill draft is first filed with the chamber clerk, and it can start, a bill can start either in the House or in the Senate. And then it goes into a public hearing process. And so there are standing committees. And so, you know, there are standing committees like Public Utilities or Health and Human Services. And so bills are kind of assigned to committees by their topic. And this is where the public can really get involved. They can go to hearings, they can testify for or against pieces of legislation. You can also submit written testimony if you're unable to testify in person. And this is a lot of times where bills can get either tweaked through amendments, or they could do like really like wholesale changes through substitute bills. Once the committee is satisfied with the work that they've done on the bill, then it goes to the full chamber for a debate and vote. And then if it passes the chamber, then it goes on to the other chamber. So if the bill started in the Senate, it will get passed to the House. If the bill started in the House, then it will go over to the Senate. And then that kind of public hearing process is repeated. And then once the second chamber votes on it, if they've made changes, concurrence might be needed between the two. And then once they get that worked out, it is sent to the governor for action. And the governor has three choices of action. The governor can sign the bill, can let the bill go into law without signing it. So if the governor does not sign it within 10 days, it automatically becomes law. Or the governor can veto the bill, which means he doesn't agree with it or she doesn't agree with it. And then the bill is then dead and does not go into effect. And so then I will pass it over to John to talk about federal advocacy.
Thank you, Sarah. Citizens Climate Lobby focuses almost entirely on federal legislation. Let me tell you a little bit about Citizens Climate Lobby. Citizens Climate Lobby is a volunteer-driven organization that focuses on empowering ordinary citizens to lobby government for climate change legislation. The basic approach of CCL is to be respectful and nonpartisan in the work that we do. We are working hard actually to build a bridge between the political left and right around climate change. We say we'd like climate change to be a bridge issue and not a wedge issue. We aim to have chapters of volunteers in every congressional district around the country, and then for each of those chapters to develop a friendly and respectful relationship with their own members of Congress, and then through those relationships to influence policymaking in Washington. We currently have chapters in something like 90% of congressional districts around the country. We do have chapters in every single district in Ohio. We say that we are laser focused on what we consider to be the first most important step in addressing climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I want to emphasize now that when we say the first step, we mean not the last step and not the only step, but the first step. We focus, in order to accomplish this, on building what we call political will. Political will is what politicians respond to. And so we say that there are 5 levers of political will. And these are the 5 areas that we focus on in Citizens Climate Lobby. So first of all is direct lobbying. We schedule meetings with our members of Congress twice a year. Pre-pandemic, we would actually travel to Washington twice a year to meet with members of Congress or their staff. And we'd meet twice a year in the district with the staff. We also make regular phone calls and emails to those congressional offices. We work through the media. We write letters to the editor of local newspapers. We look to get interviews on radio and television, and we work through social media to get out our message and to keep climate change in the public conversation and climate solutions in the public conversation. We do grassroots outreach. We do presentations like this one, and pre-pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic, we do tabling events where we We'll have a table with literature and maybe letters for people to sign to Congress and recruit new volunteers that way. We do what we call grass tops outreach, where we engage business leaders and faith leaders and other community leaders to help amplify our message with Congress. And finally, we focus on chapter development, making sure that within each of our chapters, volunteers are getting educated about the issues, and also that we're building a supportive community of activists. This is hard work, and we need to support each other to be able to persevere through all of the difficulties and all of the setbacks that we face. Now, if we think about what makes a good climate solution, these are maybe 5 criteria that we might think about. One is, of course, it has to effectively drive down carbon emissions. And we say it also should not be harmful to low-income people. Low-income people already bear the burden of climate change impacts more than anyone else. And we want to make sure that solutions are not a further burden on these people. These first 2 points in CCL, we say these are our 2 red lines. When determining whether or not to support legislation, these are the 2 most important criteria. We also want legislation, ideally, that's durable across administrations. That means it has bipartisan support. We don't want to have legislation that's passed by one party only to see the other political party take it apart as soon as political power shifts in Washington. So this is tough work, but as I said, we work hard to build a bridge between the 2 parties on these issues. We also want solutions that are good for the economy as a whole. Too often we hear that we can't act on climate because it would harm the economy. That isn't necessarily true. And so we want to prove that that's not true and that we can address climate change while also benefiting the economy. And finally, climate change is a global problem that needs a global solution. So even if we pursue federal legislation, we need to keep global solutions in mind. So for many years, Citizens Climate Lobby has focused on what we call carbon fee and dividend as that first, most important step to take in solving climate change. This is a simple and elegant approach to climate change legislation. The idea is that you charge a steadily rising fee on greenhouse gas emissions at the source where those fossil fuels are first entering the marketplace. So at the oil well, or the mine head, or the port of entry. In the beginning, you charge a small fee so it does not shock the economy, but then that fee would rise steadily at a predictable and regular rate. So everyone in the economy knows that fossil fuels are becoming more expensive over time, and everyone has to plan ahead and develop access to clean energy. This is a way to incentivize the entire economy to move towards clean energy. There are many experts in the field who say that without this kind of price on greenhouse gas emissions, we cannot adequately address climate change. And it's based on a simple principle in economics that if you want people to do something less, you should make it more expensive. Now, what do you do with the money that you raise from this fee? In carbon fee and dividend, you return the money, 100% of the net revenue, to households in the form of equal monthly dividends. It turns out that when you give the money back equally to households, it has a progressive impact. That is, low-income families tend to come out ahead financially, and wealthier families tend to lose a little bit of money. But wealthier families are more able to adapt by buying electric vehicles, putting solar panels on their homes, and so forth. Finally, in order to make this type of legislation work, you need a border adjustment to maintain a level economic playing field internationally, and to make sure that you don't create some perverse incentive for companies to leave the United States and go to another country where they can pollute more freely. So if you put a tariff on goods from other countries that do not have a similar carbon price, you can accomplish this. The wonderful thing about doing this is that it means that countries that don't have a similar carbon price now have an incentive to do the same thing. So that by enacting this kind of legislation in one large economy like the United States, you create the motivation for the entire global economy to move in the same direction. In January 2019, there was an economist statement published in the Wall Street Journal that recommended carbon fee and dividend as the best approach for dealing with climate change. This letter has now been signed by over 3,500 economists, which is the largest public statement of economists in history. The signatories include 27 Nobel laureates, 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, and 2 former secretaries of the US Department of Treasury. That's James Baker and George Shultz, both of whom worked for Ronald Reagan. If you want to see that statement and want to learn more about who signed it, you can go to econstatement.org. I want to point out that these economists include liberal and conservative economists. So Citizens Climate Lobby has spoke to Congress for years about this idea of carbon fee and dividend. And then in late 2018, it was introduced as a piece of legislation with bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress. It was called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Unfortunately, it was late in the congressional session, which means that the law expired, or the bills expired on December 31st and had to be reintroduced in 2019. The bill was reintroduced in the House, but has not yet been reintroduced in the Senate. It currently has 82 co-sponsors, including Republican Francis Rooney of Florida. How does this bill work? It's very much along the lines of carbon fee and dividend as we had long lobbied Congress for. There's a fee on fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions at the source, $15 per ton of carbon emissions in the first year, going up by $10 per ton every year thereafter. $15 per ton translates to roughly an increase of 15%, 15 cents on a gallon of gas at the pump, and then another 10 cents every year after that. The revenue from this fee is returned 100% minus administrative costs to households as a monthly dividend. There is a carbon border adjustment, just as we talked about. And finally, once Congress got a hold of us, there was some congressional sausage making that was going on. And we had long said to Republican members of Congress in particular that we can address climate change without regulations by putting a price on carbon. And so Republicans wanted some guarantee that there would not be regulations on top of the fee. And so the bill says that the EPA cannot create new regulations of greenhouse gas emissions for 10 years. If at the 10-year mark, the emissions reductions that are specified in the bill are not being met, the EPA is then mandated to develop regulations to bring emissions in line with those emissions reductions targets. Citizens Climate Lobby is okay with this regulatory pause because we have always had confidence that the fee would be sufficient to bring down emissions, and we continue to have that confidence based on what the experts tell us. So you can see that this legislation does meet the 5 criteria that I laid out earlier. It reduces US emissions 90% by 2050. That's by statute that it meets that target. Of course, this is not all of what we need. We need 100% emissions reductions globally by that year. But if we can get this much emissions reductions in the United States with a single piece of legislation, that's not bad. Most low and middle income people gain financially. In fact, a recent study that was commissioned by Citizens Climate Lobby projects that 96% of the lowest income quintile will come out ahead financially with this legislation. This bill does have conservative and liberal support. Even though we only have one Republican who is currently sponsoring the bill in Washington, we know that conservatives around the country do support this legislation or this type of legislation. Some recent polling showed that something like 75% of young Republicans under the age of 40 support this type of legislation. So that we know that there is the potential anyway of bipartisan support in Washington, and we continue to work to make that a reality. Another study done by the REMI Group, that's Regional Economic Models, Inc., projects that this legislation will create 2.8 million new jobs over 20 years. So contrary to harming the economy, it would be good for the economy. And also through the border carbon adjustment, it does incentivize global cooperation. So it's not just a single country solution. It does move us towards a global solution. On the health front, as we know, climate change has many harmful impacts on people's health. But if we just look at health impacts from air pollution, the REMI report projects that this legislation will save nearly 300,000 lives in the first 10 years of implementation. And finally, although many approaches to climate change are quite expensive to implement, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act costs $0 in new spending in Washington. That's because the fee pays for the administrative costs. And those costs, by the way, are capped in the legislation at 8% of total revenue in the first 5 years, and then no more than 2% of total revenue in every year after that. So most of the money, as you can see, is returned to households, and the federal government does not need to come up with any new money to implement this. So we can get 90% emissions reductions spending $0 new dollars. What are we waiting for? If you want to read more about this legislation, you can go to energyinnovationact.org. And so now we'd like to talk a little bit about things that are similar in advocacy on any level. If you are planning to meet with your legislators, there are some things you want to do in advance. First of all, of course, you want to research the issues involved. If you're an ordinary citizen, you may need to educate yourself. Like I said, I'm a social worker by professional background. I became involved in CCL 4 years ago. I have no background in environmental science or environmental policy or economics or politics or any of the things that I, would want to know. And so I've had to learn. And that's true for any of us getting involved in this kind of work. You want to make yourself a subject expert for your legislators. That makes you a resource for them. So you don't just go in there as a, to give your legislators a hard time. You go to offer them advice as a subject expert, but you have to make yourself into a subject expert. You also want to research your legislators. You want to know things about them, where they went to school, what kind of interest they have, what kind of bills have they supported. You want to find common ground with them. And sometimes that common ground is as simple as, a university that you attended together, or maybe that you see legislation they supported that you can thank them for. Citizens Climate Lobby likes to always begin our meetings with legislators by saying thank you for something that they've done. You want to prepare a story. In CCL, we've been taught that there are two types of people who go into a lobby meeting. There are people with opinions, and there are people with stories. And people with stories are much more effective. So you want to think about how the issue at hand has affected you personally, or maybe it's affected someone that you know, because those stories are more compelling than simply a bunch of facts and figures. You also want to be prepared to ask very clearly for what you want. Maybe it's a specific piece of legislation that you want this legislator to support. So think about what you're asking for and be prepared to ask very clearly for that. And then you want to contact the office and find out how to schedule a meeting and go through those steps. You're muted, I think, Sarah, looks like.
Yeah, I got it.
There you are.
Yeah, so when you're meeting with legislators, so at the meeting, you want to do a brief introduction, just tell them who you are, maybe some of your credentials or why you're there. Make a connection with them. So as John had said, when you're researching, if there's a way that you can find something that either you have in common or a piece of legislation that you really like that they sponsored, be able to thank them for it, or be able to just say, hey, I went to the same school as you, or, my spouse went to the same university, something like that. During the meeting, you want to make sure that you're doing 50-50 talking to listening. And so just making sure that while you are giving your story, you want to also make sure that you are listening to what they have to say as well. And so then share your story. As John was saying, the people that come in with opinions or stories, and stories are more effective. But it's also kind of the same with facts, right? So I know as physicians, you guys have a lot of data, a lot of facts, a lot of numbers, a lot of science that you want to explain. And that is great, and you should absolutely do that. But if you can pair that with a story of something that you have either personally experienced as a physician, or that you've had a patient that you can just call a patient during that story, is definitely really effective for legislators. We've seen a lot of legislators who have been contacted by somebody who shared their story, and then they became their champion when it came to an issue. And so this is something that they can go back to their districts, and when they're on the floor, they're saying I am voting for this because of this person in my district, and this is how this is going to make their life better. And so being able to kind of connect on that human level of a story is very important. And then you want to make your ask. So, will you please support bill whatever number? Or will you please vote against bill whatever number? So make sure that your ask is clear, so that you know what you're actually asking for. And then this is important. Once you make that ask, give them space to answer. So I know sometimes we can be nervous, and you make your ask and then you just start continuing talking. Actually stop for a second and let them respond first. So this way you can actually know where they stand. And if you have questions, it is perfectly reasonable to ask, can you explain that, why you feel that way? But you definitely at least want to give them space to answer from your ask. And then when the meeting is over, make sure to thank them for their time. Legislators are really busy. I know physicians are really busy as well. But being able to take some of their time to talk about your issue, just make sure that you show them appreciation for that. And then there are other ways that you can communicate. So if you cannot get a meeting scheduled, you can always send them a letter or an email. So again, make it personal, share your story, try to keep it to 500 words or less. They do get a lot of emails and mail every day. Make sure you include your contact information. And this just helps offices, especially if you're contacting your own legislator. They tend to put priority on pieces of mail or emails that come from their actual constituents within their districts. You can also give them a phone call. Be courteous, expect to talk to a staffer. A lot of these offices, especially on the local and state levels, may only have 1 or 2 staff people. And so they're usually the ones who are answering the phones, but also have a short voicemail prepared. So usually just, your name, why you're calling, the piece of legislation you're calling about, whether please consider voting for or against this piece of legislation, and then leaving your contact information. Those are good things to have prepared when you leave the voicemail. And again, because most of these offices have only a couple of staff people, sometimes they're already on the phone with other constituents, or maybe they're out of the office in a committee hearing. So just having that thing already prepared will be helpful.
In the wake of the HB6 scandal here in Ohio, Sarah and I and representatives from some other environmental groups around Ohio have been talking about what might be a good framework for Ohio energy policy going forward. What might be the principles that should undergird any new policy here? And so this is really just a working document, but these are some of the things that we've been talking about with each other, that we'd like to see Ohio energy policy move towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. And we'd like any new energy policy to be protective of low-income people. As I said, it's low-income people who often bear the brunt of climate change in the first place, or energy production. Like Sarah talked about, coal-fired power plants, often in low-income neighborhoods. And we'd like to see energy policy that protects low-income people instead of putting them more into harm's way.
And then also transition for workers who may be displaced. Especially where I grew up in southeastern Ohio, there are a lot of communities who have built their economy, and a lot of workers who have built their careers in the fossil fuel industry, whether that be in coal mining or natural gas production. And so these workers will most likely end up being displaced as we transition to cleaner energy sources. And so being able to have a way to transition these workers from those good paying jobs into other good paying jobs that are still going to be able to support their families, that's something that's very important. And then also assistance to frontline communities. These are the people and places that are the most impacted by climate change. So in Ohio, the populations that we see most impacted by climate change are usually those that are of low income. They are communities of color that have been, either zoned into or somehow placed near, industrial sites, or more towards, heavy polluting factories or coal-fired plants, natural gas plants, those kind of areas. And these are the ones that have the most health impacts as well, right? So they're breathing in air that is, that has pollutants. And so you can see in Cincinnati and Cleveland areas of low income areas or minority areas where they have higher asthma rates than either like the rest of the city and definitely the rest of the state as a whole. And so these are the communities that we want to be able to lift up and assist because they are going to need more assistance because they have been more impacted by climate change. Another group that has been really impacted by climate change that people may not think of is Ohio's farmers. With the change in weather from having heavy rains that are like unanticipated to then going through and having more 90-degree days that's causing droughts. So that is something that we also want to take a look at as well. And so if you have any questions of me, of any local policy or state policies that are going on, or how you'd like to get more plugged in and involved in advocacy on a state or local level, here's my contact information, and please feel free to reach out.
And if you would like to learn more about Citizens Climate Lobby or volunteer with us, you can go to our website at citizensclimatelobby.org. You can read about us there, you can join us there, or if you just can't wait to be a volunteer, you can text the word join to 619-675-7507. My contact information is here. You can write to me at john.sabin@citizensclimate.org. I'd love to take your questions there. And here are some resources for further study. These relate to various things that Sarah and I have spoken about today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And Sarah and I will both be part of the live Q&A panel on Friday, October 23rd at 5:30. So look forward to seeing you there.
Great, thank you, Sarah and John. Remember, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box now. And to get us started, John, I have a question for you. Are there currently any countries that have enacted a carbon fee and dividend that we can use as a case study for the US?
Yeah, actually, carbon fee and dividend has been enacted in parts of Canada. It was enacted in British Columbia initially, and then it was enacted later as what was called a backstop plan. So every province in Canada had to have some kind of climate action plan. And if they didn't come up with something by a certain date, it automatically became carbon fee and dividend. So that's been implemented in a number of provinces in Canada. So that's kind of interesting. I know that it has been effective in British Columbia. It's tricky when you try to design this as a province rather than as a country, because you can't do a border tariff when you're just a province, right? So then you do get the problem of maybe companies relocating within the country. So it's not quite an exact parallel. but we can take a look at what's going on in Canada. So that's kind of an interesting case study there.
Have there been significant decreases? I don't know how long it's been going on, if it's measurable yet.
I don't know. I mean, the broader implementation of carbon fee and dividend in Canada is recent, maybe a year or so. The British Columbia implementation is older, but my memory of that is that the fee in that case was capped at a certain level. So instead of going up every year, it went up to a certain point and then stopped. So again, that's not the same, and I don't think that's as effective. If you're going to cap it at some relatively low level, it's not going to be as effective. So I think that there has been a reduction in carbon emissions in British Columbia, but maybe not as much as we would like. And I don't think the design of the program there is quite as effective as if you could do it on a national level with a border adjustment and have the fee that's just going to go up continually until you pretty much eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from that country.
Here's a question that just came in. Are there solutions in other countries that are similar but not capped in dividend?
Well, sure. I mean, there's cap and trade, right? I mean, we have cap and trade in California right now. That's also considered a carbon price. And actually, there are a lot of countries around the world have some kind of carbon pricing mechanism in place right now. I don't think that we have a country that has this mechanism where the price goes up every single year. That's a really important part of the design of this legislation, because what it means is that fossil fuels are going to become impossibly expensive in the future. It's like a signal. It's not like, well, we can adjust to a slightly higher price. No, it's not going to be a slightly higher price. It's going to get a higher price every single year. It's going to get more expensive. So every entity in the economy has to think about switching to clean energy. That's the key.
Here is a question for either of you. Feel free to jump in. How effective are calls to action, pre-printed emails, and letters to sign, which are then forwarded to legislators?
So I'll take that one and put on my kind of cap as when I used to work in the Ohio Senate. So we would receive these all the time. And especially, I think, depending on the issue and how many you receive. So, when you first start getting these, you look at them, and definitely the ones that are from, the Senate district that I worked in, we would make sure that we would, write a personal response for each of those letters. But then once we kind of started, especially emails that were basically just kind of form letters, and we could finally start seeing like, oh, this is a form letter, then we would really just write a standard form letter back. And so then that way, anytime we get one, we would just send like the standard response back. So it's usually the ones that are a little bit more personalized, that we could tell if somebody had actually taken the time to add in some personalization to that form letter, were the ones that we would actually pay more attention to, and then would get in front of the senator for a response.
Thank you. Here's another question. What should my expectations be in meeting with an actual legislator, or should I anticipate meeting with a staff member?
You want me to take that, Sarah?
Sure.
Well, when you're talking about the U.S. Congress, you're much more likely to meet with a staff member than your member of Congress. But I think in June, we scheduled over 400 congressional meetings in June. And I think 25% of those were face-to-face with a member of Congress. But that's because we've been cultivating those relationships for years, and we've developed a good reputation. We have this strategy of going in a respectful way, and members of Congress know that. So that makes them more likely to talk to us. So it takes some work to get those face-to-face relationships, but if you're steady at it, you can get that. But most of the time you will be talking to staff members, especially in Washington. These people are very busy, and it's not personal. If they don't meet with you, it's easy to feel like, maybe you're not being treated like you're important. But we have to think about the very busy schedules that these folks are living. And so we meet with the staffers most of the time, but we get those face-to-face meetings. And those can be really illuminating, I must say, because you get to know members of Congress on television or social media or in the newspaper, and they have a kind of a public face, which oftentimes is pretty partisan, given the way our country is working these days. But then when you get into a room with that person, you're face to face with them. My experience anyway has been this surprising revelation that this person who I thought might be antagonistic is actually warm and interested and respectful. And, there's a whole different humanizing quality to meeting that member of Congress face to face. That's really different from just how you see them on television.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll say on the state level, it's more probably about 75% of the time you'll actually get to meet with the actual legislator instead of a staff person. They are, they're not traveling to DC, so usually it's a drive to to Columbus and back to their district. So they do usually have a little bit more time to meet with constituents. If you're actually meeting with a representative in their district or near where you live, that's actually a pretty 100% chance that you're actually going to meet with the legislator because their staff are all based in Columbus. And a lot of the times the staff don't travel into the districts to take meetings. That's usually up to the representative or the senator, his or herself, to actually do those meetings. So usually it's when you travel to Columbus for a part of a lobby day or some sort of larger visit where you might end up meeting with a staff person. And again, that's usually because when they're in Columbus, they're in committee hearings or in session or having to do other meetings as well. So usually for the state side, if you can get on the schedule and meet in district, you have a greater chance of actually meeting with the individual legislator than if you're meeting with them in Columbus.
Good to know. Sarah, here's a follow-up question for form letters. So this person, Dr. Gordon, she's received form letters back. Is there any tally at least to acknowledge that a constituent cares about an issue?
Yes. So usually what happens is all of the letters about a certain issue, at least in the office that I worked in, and I know a lot of offices do this a similar way, are all filed within a certain file based on the piece of legislation, and then those tallies are given to the senator or the representative to let them know that they've had so many constituents that have been concerned about this issue and written in about it.
Yeah, and we we understand that when you call, if you call a congressional office in Washington, you want to state pretty clearly what you're calling about, because they're going to put like a tally mark, like the first thing you say. And so we're tempted, because we have a strategy of saying thank you to the member of Congress at the beginning of a lobby meeting. So people are tempted to call and say, like, I want to thank you for such and such, and then start talking about climate change. But then your call might be tallied as on that thank you issue. So we always start our phone calls with, I'm calling about climate change. We want that to be tallied that way. Somebody called about climate change. And also, we understand that in Washington, members of Congress get relatively few calls about climate change. So, people are going to call in about healthcare, or people are going to call in about football players kneeling, or who knows, like all kinds of issues people get all passionate about and call Congress, but they don't call about climate change, and that's not good for our issue. So if we care about this issue, it behooves us to have organized efforts to make these calls and write letters to Congress to let them know that we care about this.
John, in your experience in working with Citizens Climate Lobby and people throughout the Midwest, I know you're a co-director of CCL Midwest. Is there more emphasis on state level climate advocacy than national level, or just passion from people, I should say?
Well, it just depends. Some people are really engaged in state level action or even local level action. CCL is really almost exclusively focused on national legislation. there are some states where if we see an opportunity for state carbon pricing where we might get involved. So when Washington State had a carbon pricing initiative on their ballot a couple of years back, CCL volunteers were involved in making phone calls to people in Washington to encourage them to vote for this carbon pricing bill, which failed. I think it's failed 3 times in Washington, different versions of it. But we got involved in that as a state level initiative. And, you know, depending on the outcome of this current election, we could focus more on state level action. If we think that there's just a gigantic roadblock in Washington, it's possible we would turn our attention more to state level action. But currently, where we focus is federal action.
Sarah, this is Alan Lockwood. Can I chime in about the lobbying visits in Washington?
Yeah, please.
I've been doing this for a couple of decades, and I remember one of the very first training sessions that I went to quite a while ago. The trainer said, don't be surprised when you go into your member's office when you meet a member of the staff who probably doesn't look like they're old enough to drive a car. But don't fool yourself. These are smart and powerful people. So have a message that's prepared to talk to them about it, because they do get back to their bosses about it.
Yeah.
You know, I've lobbied a lot for Physicians for Social Responsibility, Earth Justice, and a few other organizations, and that's pretty much the uniform experience. You almost always meet with a staffer, and then you should follow up when you're with your meeting with that staffer. Usually they'll give you a card. Sometimes they haven't been there long enough that they've got cards, but get their email address and thank them for the meeting, and try to establish a relationship with that person so that the next time that you call or show up, they know who you are.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. I just know the you know, the senator that I worked for in the Ohio Senate. You know, if somebody wanted to schedule a meeting with him and he asked them to meet with me instead, if they refused, then he never met with them, and wouldn't meet with them again, because it was like, you know, this is my staffer. You know, I trust her, and you know, she knows how to relay information to me. And so if you don't want to meet with her, then you're just not meeting with our office at all. And so, and there are a lot of senators and representatives who have that level of trust with staffers.
I know people who have had really bad experiences in a few offices too, but almost always it's a good experience. You know, these are people who are there mostly to represent us in the halls of Congress or the Senate, and they'll listen, sometimes briefly but politely, and occasionally for extended periods of time.
We also know from polling that young Republicans are quite concerned about climate change. And so when you walk into a Republican office in Washington, sometimes the member of Congress is not really on board with climate action, but you know, you can get the sense that the staffer, the young Republican staffer, may be much more concerned about climate change and much more of an ally. And so that's kind of interesting when you're talking to the staffer to know that you could have an ally in that office by talking to that young staffer because of the generational difference.
Here's another question from Dr. Gordon. There's been interesting news lately examining how climate has become partisan over the past few decades since Nixon. Are there key words that connect more with politicians who aren't on board?
Well, I wish I knew. Actually, I don't think it does go back as far as Nixon. I mean, you know, George Bush in the 90s talked about climate action. John McCain ran campaign ads saying he was going to do more for climate change than Barack Obama was going to do. This is a more recent phenomenon that this polarization has occurred. So I think the other thing too is when we get behind closed doors with Republican members of Congress, we find they're much more open to what we have to say than they might say in public. There's this weird, because of the partisan fighting, you know, it's, there are things that Republican members of Congress may say to us privately that they may be reluctant to say publicly. We keep working with them, it's like, trying to build sort of like a core group of supporters. I think that they need to work together. So that if we had a core group of Republican members of Congress who would step out together, that would make the difference. So that's what we're kind of working on.
The Yale Project on Climate Change has a lot of very granular information about public opinion to critical questions about climate change that's on their website. You can go down to your congressional district or your state level and find out what the response to a lot of questions about that have to do with climate change are. And it's broken down in some cases by political party, and more Republicans are telling pollsters, these are good pollsters who are not partisan push pollers, that they really care about climate change. They think it's caused by human activity, and they think something that should be done about it. Mm-hmm. So, we have the public behind us when we're doing this.
Yeah, and I'll just say it came up in the comments as well about not using climate change, but talking more about things like local flooding, increased rain events, having poor air quality, worse allergies. So those are some things that we have definitely used in lobbying meetings to connect with lawmakers. And I will also say, especially with the more conservative lawmakers, it's good to avoid asking them if they believe in climate change or if they believe in science. Those are usually two questions that will shut them down pretty quickly and kind of turn your conversation sour. So, having more, and again, it goes back to being able to, kind of tell your story. If you can humanize it along with facts and figures, that goes a long way.
It's good to tie into whatever issue that member is most concerned about. So if you know that they're concerned about national security, then you can talk about how climate change impacts national security. If their constituency is farmers, you can talk about climate impacts on farms. So it's important to sort of think strategically about who your audience is and what messages might resonate the best with that particular person.
I think as physicians and nurses and other healthcare practitioners, we have an advantage because we can approach it from the perspective of health, rather than saying, I want you to vote for this tax on carbon extraction or something of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
So let's switch gears just slightly, and we'll move into, we've already kind of started the live panel discussion, but we can include everybody now. We'll go with Lucinda's question here. Do advocacy groups plan different approaches depending on who wins the upcoming elections? I don't know, Sarah, Emily, if you want to talk through OEC, John, CCL, Alan, if you want to do PSR. Whoever wants to kick us off.
Well, we don't know who's going to win the election yet, but I'm sure everybody's making a plan and hoping that the next 4 years we'll find an audience in Washington that is more receptive to talking about climate change, health-related issues that are related to climate change than the present administration.
Yeah, I mean, in CCL, if Biden wins, we see our challenge as making sure that carbon pricing is a part of the conversation. We think that a Biden administration will address climate change. We want that conversation to include carbon pricing because we think it's the single most effective thing that we can do. And there are many people on the left who would rather do a regulations-only approach, which we don't think will be as effective. So that's our challenge with the Biden administration. If Trump wins the election, we may shift our focus to state and local action just because Trump doesn't seem to be supportive of any kind of climate action. That doesn't mean we would only do that, though, because it depends really on what we see in Congress, I think more and more there's a feeling in Congress that we need to take action, that we have waited too long and something needs to happen. So even with the Trump administration, we may find that there's enough momentum in Congress to move forward. Lisa Murkowski in Alaska the other day said that she thinks carbon pricing needs to be on the table. So that's a prominent Republican senator. So regardless, we're just going to press ahead because we have no other choice.
And so for OEC, I think part of the good thing is we focus really on state and local policy. So while the federal election is going to, kind of maybe change, the tenor of some of those conversations or the urgency of those conversations, I think we're still going to be able to concentrate on state and local policy. And I will say, especially in Ohio, local cities care deeply about climate change and wanting to bring, clean energy and the clean energy economy to Ohio. And so it's been actually like really refreshing to be able to be, in your local level, they're not quite as partisan as state and federal levels. Because I think these are still people who know that they're going to run into their constituents, at the grocery store or while they're getting their haircut or at a restaurant. So they're more willing to listen, and they get the urgency and the concern.
Thank
I
you.
would just add that we really shifted some of our theories of change at the OEC to focus even more so on local change. It's part of our strategic plan in all of our work, and our regional organizers are really helpful in setting up those deep relationships with us to make some of those changes. Don't discredit the power of local change that can happen.
All right, so one of the key themes in watching all of these videos over this past week I have heard is telling your story, getting people to feel something when you tell your story. So I'm just curious to know what is everyone's story and how they got involved in climate work. Start with Alan.
I don't have a single story. I have a lot of stories, but I believe in the aphorism that stories sell and numbers numb. So when I write something or think about composing a letter to the editor or an op-ed or something of that nature, it's always good to start off with something that isn't, say, like 12,000 people are going to die of heat-related illness per year in the United States. The chapter about heat illness that I wrote in my book, Heat Advisory, starts off with the story of an NFL football player who died of heat stroke because he was working out in a practice session in full gear and developed symptoms of heat illness and collapsed and then died in the hospital.
So during yesterday's session, I shared what brought me to the environmental movement, but I think for me, getting involved in climate issues, I remember talking about climate change in high school, and my high school classmates looked at me like I was crazy. It was not that long ago, but climate change was not a topic to be discussed at that point. And I carried that with me when I went to college. And I think my first real action that I took was I was involved in our student government at Ohio University. And I talked about my love of the environment and my love of climate action and what we needed to do. And I found a friend with a connection to Greek life, which was nothing that I was involved in. And we started putting together ways in which the Greek houses could become more sustainable and more green and take climate action at each one of their each one of their houses. Again, an unlikely a group that really made a lot of difference in the city of Athens with some of the actions that they were taking related to opting for more bikes, for transportation options, and really engaging in recycling and composting programs. And we did, a couple different training sessions within each of those houses. So it was a really interesting way for me to share my love with folks who could really make a difference across campus and across Athens.
Awesome. What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, so for me, I grew up in Southeast Ohio, and one of those small communities where we were on one side of the street and my grandparents were on the other side of the street, and we're surrounded by woods and so places to play. I just remember in probably around middle school, starting to see a lot of those trees getting cut down. Because the area that we lived at had a lot of coal and clay, and so they were doing a lot of strip mining for these natural resources, to the point where one day, my sophomore year of high school, distinctly remember a charge going off as they were blasting for coal, and it was so loud. It shook our house and cracked the drywall in our living room. Pretty shortly thereafter, we also then had no water. There was only like red rust and clay coming out of all of our faucets and the faucets of my grandparents across the street and the other 3 houses in the neighborhood. And so the charge that they set off was so strong that it drained the water table where we all had our local well water. And so then, it's weird being a sophomore when, you're a female and like care about your hair and like makeup and all this stuff. And then like all of a sudden, like you have no water to like brush your teeth. I just remember, and my mom was always active in politics. And so, hearing her on the phone with, the state representative and the state senators and, county officials of, how are you going to get us water? And I knew then that, this was, something that deeply impacted people and that there was no Republican or Democrat way of solving these issues. And so that's why I got involved.
Wow. That's wow. That's all I can say for that. Lucinda, would you like to share your story? Oh, is Lucinda still on? Oh, we can hear you now.
Sorry. Yeah, I was getting some pretty bad audio and couldn't tell whether you were who you were calling on. Okay. How I got involved. I was a bike commuter to work. That was kind of out of necessity. I gave my car to my daughter who was in college, who needed it more than I did. So I rode my bike a lot to work and then got into figuring out how many carbon emissions, how many pounds of carbon emissions I was saving by riding my bike to work and then riding my bike for every kind of errand that I needed to do, and realized I could save about a ton of carbon emissions a year by riding my bike to places I had to go. Then the Ohio Nurses Association was reaching out for volunteers to speak to Ohio legislators to help support the Clean Power Plan. And we had a 2-day seminar where we learned about climate change, and this was all brand new to me. It was incredible, incredibly eye-opening, plus the experience of going to the State House and speaking to actual legislators and staff about the Clean Power Plan. And these conversations I felt were very successful, so it just encouraged me even further. I kind of did not become really active while I was still working retired a couple of years ago and now have more time to actually devote to climate advocacy, and had been working with the Ohio Nurses Association on environmental issues, as well as joined ANNE, which is the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, and doing some work with that group as well.
Great, thank you, Lucinda. Dr. Heus, you want to share? I know you've kind of devoted your career to climate change. So how did your spark first get started? Oh, you were muted.
All right, so that depends a bit on how you look at it. I mean, I grew up in the Netherlands, and of course we have a decent amount of weather. We definitely have a decent amount of area below sea level. So yeah, to me it was always normal to have this, you know, to be cognizant of the environment around me in that sense. I was also recently reminded when I hooked up with an old friend from elementary school that I was the one who always had a weather station just outside of my house. So and then I through some activities in school, good math teacher, good physics teacher, I'm sure, I started being more interested in you know, how the world around us really works. So started studying physics, started at that point also the university I went to had a great school in metrology. So took a couple of courses in that, and then basically rolled into project after project. And then for a PhD, there was this great project on clouds. And turns out that clouds, even though we've been staring at them for, I don't know, a couple of millennia, we still really don't understand how they work. Not to the point where we, you know them well enough that we can understand climate. So that's really my role, I see, to, you know, this is an interesting problem. It's also, as my PhD mentor said, as opposed to the combustion subgroup in our department, was clouds are pretty, flames are ugly. So there's definitely a subjective part of that as well. It's just pretty to look at stuff outside, and I want to keep it that way. So yeah.
Thank you. And John?
Well, I think my attention was really caught by Al Gore's first movie, An Inconvenient Truth, and especially the scene where he gets in a cherry picker to show, you know, current levels of carbon dioxide, and he has to go way above the stage to demonstrate that. That kind of opened my eyes. But, you know, like I said, I was a social worker. I have no background in environmental science, and I didn't think that I had any way of helping to solve this problem, except, you know, maybe some small lifestyle changes I made. But I really thought, you know, politicians, economists, and very smart people were going to take care of the problem. And I would give money to environmental groups a little bit, you know, $30 here or there. And I was encouraged by the Paris Climate Accord, and I expected, and I'm speaking personally now, right? Because CCL is a nonpartisan organization, but this is my personal story. I expected that a Clinton administration would continue that progress that Obama had made. And then when Trump was elected, after he had said that climate change was a hoax created by the Chinese, you know, at that point, I just knew that giving $30 every now and then to 350.org was not adequate, not for me. I just knew that I couldn't live with myself if that was the only contribution I was making. And I actually did a Google search on the phrase climate change volunteer. And then up came Citizens Climate Lobby, and I kind of immediately fell in love with what I read and joined. I think it was November 16th, 2016. It was the week after the election. I joined CCL. And 4 years later, I'm one of the Great Lakes regional coordinators for CCL. So my life has been completely changed. So that's how I got involved. And also, I found out that being a social worker is not useless after all, because so much of what we do has to do with human connections. And that's what I know about as a social worker. So it turns out I had a valuable skill after all, I just didn't know it.
Then Emily, I think you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yes, I do. I had to find it. I think along the lines of thinking back into your time with climate change, what's your best advocacy moment? What's that story that really always brings a smile to your face when you had the chance to talk with a lawmaker or at the local level, at the national level on climate, that makes you feel inspired?
Who would like to kick us off?
Well, I can tell you a story. I was in Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C., and I had this pile of papers tucked under my arm, and there was something in there about, I was very interested in pesticides at the time. It said something like no adverse effect level, and this guy came up to me and started talking to me. It turned out he was also a physician, and he worked in Senator Clinton's office. I lived in New York State at the time. And we sat there in the lobby of the Reagan National Airport and talked about pesticides. And this fellow was at Mount Sinai, and he worked with Phil Landrigan, who is a really important person in child environmental health issues, member of the National Academy of Sciences, and now he's gone on to a career in this area. So it has cracked me up a bit listening to these stories about when people were in high school. When I was in high school, we were doing duck and cover drills under the desks in our classroom, and we would hear radio spots, asking people to sign up to be plane spotters looking for Russian bombers who were expected to fly over the North Pole at any moment.
I think for me, a moment of inspiration is not just the first time, but every time I've been to Washington to join a Citizens Climate Lobby conference and lobby day. This can sometimes feel like a lonely work, and it's such difficult work. And it can be so discouraging to do this work. And so going to a conference and walking into a room where there are 1,200 climate activists in one room, I just feel so euphoric when I walk in and I see that. And then a few days later, everybody's posing in front of the Capitol. And then we just take over the congressional office buildings. The cafeterias are full of CCL volunteers, and the hallways are full of CCL volunteers, and we're just everywhere. And members of Congress know it. The CCL army has arrived. It's a very inspiring experience.
One of our national meetings that was held in Chicago, we had meetings where they served food at breakfast, lunch, and dinner and stuff like that. And the wait staff who was picking up the plates and putting the food out took up a collection, and their head waiter came up to our president at the time and presented this pile of cash that, we were so taken by the message that you all are telling that we decided, we had to help you out.
Wow.
That's so great. Would anybody else like to share?
So
Yeah, this is Lucinda.
Go ahead.
I was fortunate enough to speak to some legislators and an environmental related group, the Rails to Trails organization, which their job is to create bike trails and hiking trails out of former railroad rails that for trains that no longer go there. And the object is to encourage more people to use bikes as transportation and also recreation. and for health reasons as well. And we had organized a trail ride over the lunch hour and had invited the Ohio legislators that we were targeting to help vote for the funding to continue for that project. And it was amazing. We had about a dozen Ohio legislators on their bikes out on trails in Columbus, because there actually is a connection point pretty close to the State House. And we rode bikes for about an hour, and then came back inside and went around and visited each one that we had targeted, and the funding passed, so that it was successful as well.
I think similarly to Lucinda's story, at my former organization, I worked for a land conservation organization, and we were able to host a number of lawmakers on different parks that we had helped create throughout Northeast Ohio, and seeing the joy on lawmakers and staff members' faces when they got to see some of the work that they had helped advocate for us, whether it was funding or helping make connections. I think seeing folks in the field is always really exciting, and I tend to believe that it's true joy when you get to stand at Mentor Marsh and have a bald eagle fly overhead and think, wow, like my advocacy helped create this.
Awesome. Anybody else would like to share?
One of my favorite lobbying stories with OEC was actually one of the first times that I was able to go to Washington, D.C. With our executive director. And we were sitting in a congressman's office, and doing the introductions, and he was, so what county, are you guys from? And Heather had originally grown up in Washington County near Marietta, and I grew up in Jackson, and he just kept looking at me. And Heather had shared that she had worked for former Governor Ted Strickland in DC as his chief of staff, and so knew a lot of people there, in the Capitol building. And I was like, well, I grew up in Jackson, which I know you used to represent, but I'm like, you probably know me because I worked for, and gave him the name of the senator that I had worked for in the Ohio Senate. And he just kind of stopped and looked at the two of us. And so I worked for a Republican conservative senator in the Senate. And he was like, he was more conservative than I am. And he was like, and you two work together? And we're like, yeah. And he was like, well, and I was like, honestly, I'm like, the environment should not be a partisan issue that we have made it, out to be. And you could tell he let his guard down and changed and really listened to what we had to say, because he was just like, I am just so flabbergasted by this. I can't even get my head around it, but I want to hear more now. And so that was actually one of the more fun conversations that we had that day.
That's so great. Anyone else?
Hi, Anna. It's Dr. Gordon. I got my microphone working. I want to just really thank everybody for this really candid and informative conversation. I personally have not done advocacy for a variety of reasons, but I do have my story about where I started with things, and it was really just as a kid that I would go with my parents and my brother to the supermarket and return the bottles for 5 cents, and then became interested in animals, and then just brought it with me all the way through medical school and graduate school, and just brought that interest and sort of passion to my workplace. That's really how I made the connection. I do realize there's only a few of us laboratory professionals in the climate and health world, but yeah, we're you know, everybody can have their angle, I guess. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with this group and participate in this great discussion. And thank you all, really. This has been such a fabulous week. And I really, really appreciate everybody's participation and sharing your vast knowledge on these topics. I'm really pleased with how everything went. So thank you all.
Yes, I will echo.
I can help you find your inner activist.
The final question to end out this session will be, what is one action that clinicians can do right now to get involved when they're so short on time? And you can't say vote, vote is a given.
I'm gonna snatch up the next thing to say, and that is to encourage 5 folks in your network to vote, because actually, as you tell your story, you are one of the most effective messengers, and we continue to find that when you make that direct outreach to people in your network and ask them to vote, there's a higher likelihood that they are going to engage in that work. So yes, it's important for you to vote, but I challenge everyone to make that effort to reach out to folks in your network too.
Sorry, you can't do that, not a citizen. At least not in this country. What I would say is talk to each other. Talk to not just lobby to politicians, but talk to people around you, to neighbors. I mean, when I walk here, well, when I am to my neighbors at any, well, when they ask me what am I doing, and yeah, climate, and then there is an immediate conversation. And as long as you can keep that conversation polite, respectful, and don't ever circumvent the phrase of, do you believe in climate change? There's no such thing as believing in that. But if you have a respectful conversation, most people would support, and the more, I mean, like I think John said, that there were relatively few people calling to DC about climate change. I guess one of the ways to change that is to make it a very common topic to talk about just on the street during Thanksgiving. Well, that's just going to be your local family this year, but you get the point. Keep on talking to each other.
I want to say that CCL has created a health professionals climate action and carbon pricing declaration that health professionals can sign. This declaration is not endorsing any specific piece of legislation, but it calls for federal carbon pricing legislation that is bipartisan, achieves a rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and protects households by returning the revenue from the fee to households as a dividend. So if any of you are interested in signing that resolution, email me and I'll get you a link so you can sign the declaration.
Any other advice?
I would be really remiss if I did not say your first action should be go and sign up to become a member of Ohio Clinicians for Climate Action.
That's in my closing spiel.
And I want to thank you and other people who organized this. An honor to be invited and to be part of this. Thank you for all your good work.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you all. It's been great having you. Look forward to speaking with you again and seeing you in person at some point.
Yes. All right, so we are at time, so I will end with this. Please don't forget to complete the survey if you haven't clicked it already. It is in the chat box. A big thank you to all the speakers who joined us tonight over the course of this whole symposium, our planning committee, and all those who attended. We wouldn't do this without you guys. We couldn't do it without you. We ask that you get more involved in advocating for positive climate solutions. We mentioned a few ways to do that this evening. We would love to have you join Ohio Clinicians for Climate Action, where you can use your voice as a trusted messenger to educate those in the communities and legislators on health-harming impacts of climate change and advocate for solutions to improve outcomes for the environment and our health. You can email me at occa@theoec.org or visit Ohio Clinicians for Climate Action's website at ohcliniciansforclimateaction.org.